Please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief, Ravi Agrawal.
All right, good morning. Hello, everyone. How are you? All right, good energy. Welcome to FP's Tech Forum. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy and the host of FP Live. And just at the outset, I really want to say, I know it's a super busy week for all of you. I know you have many places to be at, and so I'm very grateful that you've chosen to spend your morning here with us at FP. We also have a global audience watching us on live stream. So a very warm welcome to you as well, wherever you are in the world. Now, I just want to start with a dose of honesty. This is a difficult year for the United Nations. Between the wars in Europe and the Middle East, the UN feels paralyzed, especially at the Security Council. It can't agree on much, and the big powers are often accused of putting their interests before the interests of the world as a whole. And because of that, there's a growing sense that things simply can't get done at the United Nations. Now, that might be true when it comes to ending wars, but I have learned over time that it is not true when it comes to several other areas. The ones where smaller technical bodies thrive, the ones that do work in, whether it's uniting the world on technology, whether it is organizations like UNICEF, which do work with children in countries around the world. There are organizations that are getting things done, and there are countries that are cooperating on issues. This week is actually a great example of that. If there's an issue that the United States and China can actually talk to each other on, it's probably AI or maybe climate. It's certainly not other areas that we tend to think about when we think of the United Nations. So on AI, I mean, the two of them actually joined hands earlier this year at the UN to announce a global resolution on AI. There have been more advances on that in the last few days. And there is a lot more when it comes to tech that countries actually can agree on. Improving digital infrastructure, getting more people online. There are still 2 billion people on Earth who are not connected. Trying to figure out how to manage cyber threats. There's so much cooperation that we still need. We're going to discuss all of that and more with a range of star speakers today. I'm very excited about that. Now, before we go there, just a few quick housekeeping notes. If you're here in the room, you have on your chairs an FP magazine, which I urge you to read. The cover this year is called Letters to the President. It's a set of nonpartisan letters written by thinkers from around the world who are trying to advise the next president, whoever he or she may be, on how to manage, how to lead in a constructive way that actually helps the whole world. You also have a small postcard with a QR code. If you look at that, you can follow the whole program for the day and see what's what. And of course, if you're watching us online, everything is right in front of you. You know what to do. I'm told we are not taking audience questions live, but I believe many of you in this room and online have already fed into this discussion. Last thing, and certainly not least, I'd like to thank our partners, CEPI, Luminate, Microsoft, Meta, and Regulating AI. Thank you for the work you do. We could not do this without you. So let's get going. Enjoy the next 3 hours. In each case, we're going to push our speakers to try and explain how policymakers can simultaneously keep pace with innovation while ensuring that emerging technologies advance the public good. We need to enhance the best of tech, but we need to do it while governing it and not letting it govern us. So I'll leave you with that thought. Let's get started.
Please welcome Doreen Bogdan-Martin, Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, for a fireside chat on accelerating tech capabilities across UN nations.
Secretary General, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's a very busy week for you, I know.
Indeed.
So I thought I'd begin with something very simple. Just in 30 seconds, tell us what the ITU does.
So the ITU is the UN Agency for Digital Technologies. We've been around since 1865, from the telegraph to the telephone, to the television, to the internet, to artificial intelligence. We're all about radio communication standards and development, connecting the unconnected.
Yeah, it really is crazy that this began with the telegraph. I guess let me start with this. Your organization has long been involved in bridging gaps of various sorts. When you think today of the fact that upwards of 2 billion people are not connected to the internet, what can an organization like yours do about that?
Well, so the ITU has actually a unique membership. So we have 194. We got a new member state last week, Palau. So we have our member states, but we also have private sector members. So we have 1,000+ private sector members, and we also have academic members, civil society, the technical community. And so through that platform, we can leverage partnerships, we can advance standards, we can decide on appropriate spectrum to be able to connect the hardest to connect. And that's our goal, to get to those 2.6 billion unconnected.
And what are the biggest hurdles there? Because for the better part of a decade or so, we've been seeing that there is this problem with last mile connectivity, even with spectrum, even with mobile internet. You look at much of Africa, much of Asia, people have gotten online through smartphones. What are the hurdles that you're struggling with?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost is putting in that right regulatory policy framework that will be predictable and attract the needed investment. The second piece, of course, is the investment. We did some estimates some years ago where we said that it would take $428 billion to connect the unconnected. We actually think that that number is probably much higher, and so is the investment piece. The other piece is affordability. So if we have succeeded in covering the world with a mobile signal, why do we still have 2.6 billion unconnected? A lot of that has to do with skill building, digital literacy, has to do with content, lack of relevant content, but it also has to do with the cost of the device. So we need to be very focused on that device cost as well. And of course, safety and security. With online threats increasing, there are growing concerns around cybersecurity where people are intentionally deciding not to connect.
So it seems to me one thing that connects all of this, as well as everything else we're going to discuss here today, is digital literacy. If people aren't equipped with the how of using their equipment safely, of being, online citizens who understand how the internet works, and understand how to deal with threats, we're in trouble. And we've seen this with elections in the past. There's a lot to worry about. How are you thinking about bridging the digital literacy gap?
Yeah, the digital literacy piece is a huge one, and we have to address it. So we have many different programs. We have a big focus on child online protection together with UNICEF. We also have our GIGA initiative with UNICEF. It's ambitious. We seek to connect every school in the world to the internet by 2030. Half of the world's schools are not connected, so when it comes to digital literacy, obviously there's a big gap right there in the fact that those schools are not connected. Of course, we work closely with UNESCO as well. We have different initiatives. We have a big digital transformation center in Ghana that focuses on that basic digital literacy.
And what kind of funding do you need to make this happen? I mean, it strikes me that we're talking about, crazy amounts of money for last mile connectivity in villages that have tiny schools.
Yeah. Well, it's going to take it's going to take a multi-stakeholder approach. I have to say that because it's not going to be the governments alone. It's not going to be the development banks alone. We really do need to pull together. We have our Partner to Connect platform that seeks to raise $100 billion in commitments by the end of 2026. So far, we have $51 billion that's been mobilized in commitments and pledges, and the focus is to get to the hardest to connect.
So let's get to AI, because I feel like every discussion ends up there, especially in a week like this one. When I think about tech regulation in the last decade, I think everyone can now admit that we got some things wrong, that we weren't able to properly regulate, especially big tech, to make sure certain standards were in place to ensure election integrity and the likes. If we didn't get regulation right in Web 1.0 and 2.0, how do we get it right this time with AI?
Yeah. I feel like every discussion I've been in the past week here in New York is about AI, because we do have to find a way to get it right. And as you said in your opening, the challenge is technology, AI is moving so fast. And how can we structure a policy response that can keep up with AI? I don't think that's going to happen. So we have to put in place something where we're managing the risks and the security and the privacy, but we're not stifling that innovation. We have our AI for Good platform, something that we started back in 2017, pre-generative AI. And what we're trying to do through that platform is really focus on how can we leverage AI to achieve the SDGs, and what kinds of standards development processes can we put in place. We have a collaboration with IEC ISO, where we're very focused on deepfakes, multimedia authentication, and trying to advance that response together.
So I mentioned very optimistically in my opening remarks that this is an area where the United States and China actually are willing to talk to each other. Can you give us a sense of how that works behind the scenes?
Well, we have the high-level advisory body report that just came out, the UNSG's report, and the Global Digital Compact. And I think there are good elements to build upon. What we're seeing is that the concentration of AI discussions, as the report cites, is really focused on 7 countries, of course, including the US and China. A big focus on mitigating the risks, big focus on looking at the compute gaps, and of course, a big focus on the capacity development. And as you said, there may not be a lot of things that the world agrees on these days, but I think everyone agrees that digital technologies can be life-changing, but we need to get it right. And the SG said yesterday, when he opened the high-level debate, is that we need to make sure that we come together and make sure that AI is a force for good and not for bad.
So I have a tricky question for you now, moving on from the China aspect of this. There's a phrase that is increasingly becoming vogue in foreign policy, and that's sort of a global axis of evil. I hate the phrase. I hated axis of evil when it was first sort of rolled out during the Iraq War. But anyway, there's a loose alliance of autocracies of sorts. There's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and they tend to pop up in various disputes around the world. That's obviously not your domain, but I'm curious how, when I mentioned that stuff like that paralyzes many other discussions when it comes to ending conflicts, how does it not paralyze the discussions you're in that are around tech or AI? And how do you trust each other?
Yeah, well, I think globally there is a deficit when it comes to trust. But I think fortunately in the ITU, we like to say that we're consensus-based. We focus on radio communications, for example, our spectrum focus. So we're looking at the future of 6G. And in those discussions, all players come to the table, whether they're from China, whether they're from the US, whether they're from Europe, and they have to come to agreement on the right technical standards, the right spectrum allocations in order to make technology work. I don't think we can afford today to have 2 technology spaces and to have a complete fragmentation and have 2 internets. And so the ITU is a great platform to bring those stakeholders together, be it in standards discussions, spectrum discussions, or global development discussions with policymakers and regulators.
So the other big area this week that everyone's hoping there is some cooperation around that we can get behind in the lead up to COP29 is climate change, of course. And there's a growing sense that tech eats up a lot of energy. AI and sort of the precursors behind it, semiconductors, a lot of energy goes into that. Is that in contradiction with the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, AI is thirsty when we think about water consumption and also, of course, the energy demand. But what we have also seen is that AI can be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions anywhere from 5 to 10%. We're also very focused on electronic waste. And believe it or not, only 20% of electronic waste gets recycled. And so that's a growing concern when we think about sustainability. We've put together something called the Green Digital Action Coalition, and so we're gearing up for COP29. This will be the first digital ministerial that will take place in the context of a COP. So big focus on digital, trying to bring partners together to look at what we can do to advance green digital.
Honestly, I really hope you succeed. I'm afraid we're out of time. For the audience here, I will be back in a bit, but let's hear it for Doreen Bogdan-Martin of the ITU.
Thank you.
Please welcome Dr. Cordula Druga, Chief Legal Officer and Head of the Legal Division at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Courtney Gregoire, Microsoft's Vice President and Chief Digital Safety Officer, along with Foreign Policy's Dr. Maisha Alam, for a panel discussion on safeguarding lives and critical infrastructure in conflict.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be with all of you here in New York, and to our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity now to talk to two really incredible leaders who are trying to address some of the most pressing problems in our world, and that relates to how to protect critical infrastructure and civilians from cyber attacks and digital threats, especially at a time when the nature of war is evolving and AI and emerging technologies are posing all kinds of new risks that have destructive impacts, but at the same time could be used potentially to address those challenges. And so let's dive right in, and I'd love to begin with you, Cordula. You are the Chief Legal Officer at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and are at the helm of virtually everything that relates to how IHL is operationalized and implemented. So just to get us a common understanding, can you help everyone understand what is the digital emblem? Like, what are we talking about when we say that, and how can it be operationalized in accordance with international humanitarian law in conflict settings?
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to take part in this panel. So to start with what the digital emblem is, let's start with what is the emblem of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So in armed conflict situations for about 160 years, since the late 19th century, you have, and you've all seen this, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent emblems. And in conflict situations, the Geneva Conventions, which regulate the conduct in war and are the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions foresee that entities and hospitals and military hospitals and civilian hospitals, as well as humanitarian organizations of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, can bear the sign of the emblem of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and this sign signals that they are protected against being attacked in armed conflict situations. So you cannot attack a hospital, and the emblem just shows this is a hospital, you cannot attack me. And nowadays, of course, in armed conflicts, we have more and more digital operations, cyber operations that disrupt or even destroy infrastructure through cyber means, and not just by dropping bombs on them, for instance. And so hospitals can be disrupted, first aid stations, the work of international organizations. We have very sensitive data on missing persons, on detainees, etc. And these things are vulnerable to cyber operations. And so the idea is to transform this emblem, which exists in the physical world on the, on the roofs of hospitals as well, to be a watermark, as it were, for digital infrastructure of hospitals and humanitarian organizations that are protected. So that's the idea of a digital emblem. It's a digital watermark to signal what is already protected by the Geneva Conventions in modern conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that really helps folks understand like what exactly we're talking about. And your last point, I think, is one to really underscore, which is what is already protected under international law, right? But how do we make that happen? And what does that actually look like when we think about the technology involved? And Courtney, you are head of digital security at Microsoft, and so many of the world's applications and functions, including public services, run on Microsoft platforms. So tell us a little bit about how Microsoft has engaged with the ICRC and other partners when it comes to advancing this idea of the digital emblem, and how does that fit into your broader work as relates to protecting civilians and critical infrastructure during armed conflict?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for inviting Microsoft to join this conversation. And I'll put this a little bit in context from how we observe really the global threats in this space. Microsoft has a unique surface area in which we see the line between peace and war in the digital environment really blurring. We see over 340 million cyber attacks a day, and that is across the ecosystem. And we are honestly constantly monitoring over 300 named threat actors on a regular basis. Let's put this in the context of armed conflict, if you will. Cyber operations are really oftentimes the core of those modern conflicts. If we look at Ukraine alone, in February 2022, massive hacker attacks really accompanied the first missile attacks of Ukraine. And those hacker attacks targeted critical infrastructure in Ukraine, state bodies and their digital footprint, mass media, financial institutions, and many commercial services as well. On their main websites, what did that mean? If you went there, they saw literally Z propaganda, lay down your arms, on the state-sponsored Ukraine websites. So we see this threat environment and understand from a digital space how we've thought about preserving information ecosystems before. Many of you in the room probably understand that a critical digital lock, when you go to your financial website, that gives you a sense of security, but behind that, we think of the need in this space about how we take the lessons learned for hundreds of years about marking critical infrastructure. And we know the implications it would have to address the cyber threats. We need to pair that up with those like Microsoft who are constantly thinking about the monitoring the threat ecosystem and leveraging that information to continue to secure and harden our digital spaces.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really, really instructive, and in particular, the examples that you shared from Ukraine and many other contexts. As you were saying, the impacts are not just disruptive, but they can be destructive. They can lead to lives lost and very real damage done, both to humans as well as to institutions and to infrastructure. Staying on this theme of, okay, we are trying to build buy-in for this idea. It's already rooted in international humanitarian law, but taking it a step further and being able to implement it and put it into practice. Cordula, let me ask you this. Why are standardization and integration so important for the digital emblem? And how are you working with governments, with the tech industry, with civil societies, or other humanitarian partners in order to be able to move this work forward?
So you need standardization because, of course, the internet runs on all these interconnected devices. And they don't necessarily communicate all in the same way. And so you have standardization in order for these different devices to actually sort of speak the same language, as it were. Because unlike in the physical world, the internet presupposes that you have the same language across those devices and that they are able to communicate with each other. So that's why you need a standardization for a digital emblem, so that it's recognized and the same across the board. And integration, what we mean by integration is the integration of the emblem into international law, in particular international humanitarian law, because as I was saying before, the emblems in the physical world are integrated into the Geneva Conventions. They're protected by the Geneva Conventions, and the Geneva Conventions require all states in the world are parties to the Geneva Conventions. And so states are required to respect these emblems, but also to protect them in their own jurisdiction, to prevent abuse of these emblems in their own jurisdictions, etc. And so, you need an international treaty in order to agree on the rules that govern this emblem. And maybe to give an image that a colleague of mine uses, if you imagine a country with busy crossroads, right, and each intersection has stop signs. Now, imagine if there were no laws regulating what a stop sign actually means, or no laws preventing anyone from placing the stop sign in random places. So you need agreement on what does the stop sign mean, where can it be put, etc. And the same thing for a digital emblem. You need agreement about what does this emblem mean for everyone, and what are the rules that everyone has to respect for a digital emblem. And so in international humanitarian law, you have several ways of doing so, and this is one of the things that we're currently discussing with states of what are the avenues for them that they could consider. So for instance, there are additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and you could just do an extra additional protocol about this emblem, and then you would have, and a protocol is the same as an international treaty, and so states would ratify this treaty and say, okay, we agree that we will recognize this emblem, we will use the same emblem and the same way the emblem is done in the internet, and we will play by the rules.
Yeah, and so much of what you said, Cordula, really emphasizes the role of states, and in particular state parties to the Geneva Convention and more broadly the international community coming to consensus on this. From both of your vantage points and the work that you do, can you share some examples of kind of what you see as the role and responsibility of governments? And are there any examples of attacks either on hospitals or ports where you can draw lessons learned from, that you have observed and addressed in recent years? Maybe Cordula, I'll come to you first and then to Courtney.
Yeah, so perhaps to go back a few years when we first, observed more and more cyber operations appearing in armed conflict situations, we didn't know yet what could be the consequences of such operations. And from a perspective of a humanitarian organization, you always start with what is the human cost of the weaponization of anything. So any new weapon or any new technology used in armed conflicts will have a human cost for civilians in particular. And so we were looking at what is the potential human cost. And of course, the thing that comes to mind to you immediately is, cyber attacks on dams or nuclear power plants, etc. Sort of horror scenarios which are possible, but which we haven't seen yet, fortunately, or at least not with terrible consequences. But when we started analyzing this and asking, experts about it, one of the things that became very clear very quickly was that, in particular, security people from medical institutions, hospitals, etc., were explaining to us that the digitalization of medical services had gone very fast, but wasn't really followed with the same security infrastructure. And so they realized that hospitals were quite vulnerable, actually, to cyber attacks and cyber disruptions. And this was borne out actually then during COVID, which wasn't an armed conflict situation, but still during COVID, we saw a lot of a lot of attacks on medical infrastructure. And so we realized that that was a particular vulnerable sector. And then we saw, but this is actually a sector which in armed conflicts is protected by this emblem, and is in general protected from attack in armed conflict situations. So how can we work on this to improve the situation?
Yeah, no, that's really important. And of course, it's not just hospitals, right? There's so many different types of critical infrastructure. Over to you, Courtney.
Yeah, I'll extend in the healthcare space because we did have the opportunity as Microsoft to partner with ICRC during the pandemic and really understand. I mean, I will bring the analogy full circle. Obviously, if we think about how financial institutions understood that they were a critical threat for cyber attacks because of the monetary incentive, you quickly saw decades ago the need for a chief cybersecurity officer within a financial institution. That is not how the healthcare system is structured, and they haven't invested in that way. We see over the landscape, and we did a survey in this in 2023, that actually the healthcare institutions are the most likely critical infrastructure to be attacked by ransomware, up 130% year over year. So Microsoft has been thinking about this really holistically. We this year announced our rural hospital initiative focused on in helping cybersecurity with those rural hospitals. That means training, technical advice, in addition to low or free technology to critically do that space. But I think the recognition that there needs to be an understanding that is a no-go zone we could all understand for offensive cyber attacks. How do we build an international standard to do that is critical as we help build the capacity of those institutions. You ask about other critical infrastructure, and actually, let's talk about the human cost of that. I think you can pick up the paper and you see what happens at hospitals when they are brought down by a ransomware attack. They talk about the delayed access to blood transfusions, to surgeries, and what that means for the real human impact. On other critical infrastructure, we're seeing ports hit pretty regularly. I used to have the pleasure of serving as a commissioner for the Port of Seattle. A ransomware attack just 2 weeks ago took down the infrastructure for 6 days as the airport tried to figure out how to get back online. And so we need to be thinking about critical infrastructure all up, but it is unique how the healthcare sector is vulnerable and deserves our protection.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, the examples that you shared really illustrate that this is a global problem and one that is affecting countries that are both experiencing or emerging from armed conflict, but also those that are not, and increasingly becoming almost a tool, a geopolitical tool, in lieu of, kinetic operations, right? And that's also a really important challenge. So when we think about where do we go from here? We're here on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. The Summit of the Future is happening. And I know you're working to build momentum around these issues. And so let me ask you this, what is it that you would like to see going forward in the coming months, in the coming weeks, and going into the new year? What are the most important critical steps that need to be taken in order to really make that digital emblem, as you said, universally accepted, universally recognized? And what are you anticipating as the biggest challenges? And so maybe, Cordula, I'll come to you first and then go to Courtney.
Okay, so we continue to work with many different partners, of course, governments, universities, academic institutions, to develop the emblem technically, but then also to think in policy terms, how can we achieve agreement on the emblem? And perhaps on the substance, we need to come to agreement on the legal requirements. I think that's not a big hurdle, because in a way they derive from the legal requirements that you already have in the physical world. So, it has to be trustworthy to be effective. So you need agreement by everyone. And it can't be used to fake protection, for instance. It also requires that it is only used, and this is also foreseen in the Geneva Conventions, when it has the authorization by the competent authority. So, this is how it works with the emblem. You have to have the authorization of the competent authority to be able to bear the emblem, and that's the parties to the conflicts and states that give this authorization. Then you also need a requirement that the emblem has to be able to be removed at any time, because things can, depending on whether they're in armed conflict situations or not, and depending on what functions they fulfill, they can be protected or not. So you have to be able to remove the emblem, including in the digital space, which is, I think, fairly easy to achieve technically, not that I understand anything about the technology of it. And then perhaps a bit more, which you might be a bit more surprised by, but actually makes sense when you think about armed conflict cyber operations. It requires technically that you can also identify it and inspect it when you're doing a covert operation, because of course parties to conflicts do covert operations to sort of look at what can they target and what can't they target. And of course, if they were immediately identified, they wouldn't be able to do this. So that's another technical requirement that we need for this digital emblem. And so with all these requirements, what we did after careful consideration and after, exploring several options was to focus the work on the authentic digital emblem, ADEM, which essentially uses certificate chains to signal protection. And so for the digital emblems, the certificates would be used to mark the digital infrastructure of these medical facilities and Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations and their networks and their devices. And so that's the sort of the technical next steps, and we're working on those technical next steps, and then we are also working on the policy and legal steps, and we have in October a big conference called the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which brings together states and national societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and that's, for instance, one of the instances where we will discuss the digital emblem and sort of try to move the conversation forward, so that hopefully in the next month or couple of years we can move towards such an emblem.
Great. And Courtney, from your perspective?
I think you have the harder job here, let's be honest. You articulated, Microsoft is proud to be a technical advisor in the development of this, but the technical standard is achievable and has been done in other contexts. So we continue to want to collaborate and support that, recognizing the opportunity for governments to make sure they're buying into the legal framework is that critical hard work. One extension of this comment would be the need to continue to monitor the technical environment with the digital emblem. We are very early days talking about what it means to think about content provenance and watermarking in the era of AI holistically. How do we have the opportunity as the average person to look at our information ecosystem and understand, am I looking at AI-generated content, or am I looking at a different type of image or other audio, etc.? We will be learning lessons from that space that are very applicable here. And one of the lessons that we know as we advance towards a standard in Microsoft, pushing very much for a standard for content provenance in the AI space, we're going to need legal frameworks to support that those that intentionally manipulate content provenance and metadata behind it have legal consequences under their nation-state laws. So I think that will be a continued space and overlap here to extend and continue to make sure that there's resilience.
Yeah, and that last point is such an important one, because it's going to require industry-wide cooperation and collaboration, right? Microsoft is at the forefront of leading much of this work and supporting it. But in order for it to actually be universally accepted and to be operationalized, it's going to have to be really a wide ecosystem of actors, or wide range of actors. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question, which is, you have been confronting so many different types of digital threats and cyber operations within the context of hybrid warfare. And, Ukraine's come up a few times, but it's not unique to Ukraine by any means. What do you think is the most important lesson learned in terms of building that resilience, Courtney, that you were talking about, to the types of threats and operations that you're seeing? And so maybe Courtney, I'll go to you first from your perspective, as Microsoft, and then Cordula from your perspective when it comes to IHL.
My first thought is, one core principle as to how Microsoft wants to advance this conversation is very much being transparent about the prevalence of these cyber operations, to the best that we can, the nation state actors that we identify behind them. And Microsoft consistently releases our threat intelligence in this way transparently, publicly, because of the conversation we're having here right now. This is not a only state actor to state actor engagement anymore. The need for broader awareness across critical infrastructure. We will continue to monitor these, transparently make them everyone understand what this means. Now we get to what is that resilience moment. And I think we are having a conversation across all critical infrastructure, the need to think about cybersecurity at the core of that operations. Now, how do we do that in a economically appropriate way is that critical next step. So what is the opportunity to bring that not just to rural hospitals, but really globally, what it means to be able to think about cybersecurity resilience and understand that. We build it back into our products. We share the information so the ecosystem can do that. But yes, a hospital administrator needs to be thinking top of mind, how are they going to protect their critical infrastructure as well?
So back to conflict situations, right? And when you ask what are the most critical threats, and it won't surprise you that when you look at conflict situations, the most critical threat is always that it affects civilians. In the physical world, you see this very clearly, right? And we have this core principle in international humanitarian law, which is the principle of distinction, which requires that military attacks can only ever be targeted at civilians and at military and military infrastructure, and not at civilians and civilian infrastructure, right? This is the core principle of all the rules of war. And the specificity, of course, of the digital space is that very often civilian and military infrastructure is intertwined. And so I would say what needs to be done is segregation, segregation, segregation wherever possible. This will be the best way to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict situations. So for instance, whenever possible, and of course there are technical and economic considerations here, but whenever possible to separate, for instance, if you have data on a cloud, separate the medical data from military data, for instance. This will be a key way to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure from being really affected in armed conflict situations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. I mean, this is such a complex issue, and I feel like we've only just barely scratched the surface of it, but so urgent too, and one that really is going to be shaping the perpetuation and resolution of conflicts worldwide. For those of you who are interested in learning more on this topic, we at Foreign Policy, and in particular FP Analytics, which is our independent research division and the team that I lead, have been partnering with Microsoft and ICRC and others now for a number of years on a multimedia project called Digital Front Lines. And we've had contributions from the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber in the US, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, and Cordula, among others, who've contributed perspectives on how do we actually deal with and address and protect civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure in this time of hybrid warfare. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's digitalfrontlines.io. But thank you both, Cordula and Courtney, for being here and for the work that you're doing. And I wish you success as you navigate this very complex but important issue. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Please welcome the Honorable Nele Liosk, Ambassador for Digital Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, and Foreign Policy's Jack Detch, for a discussion on digital threats and national security.
global digital diplomacy, critical infrastructure in the digital space, and that's something the UN's been talking about a lot this week. We saw at the Summit for the Future a global digital compact being agreed to for the first time, the UN having ambitions to regulate AI and be involved in financial markets. This is a very ambitious agenda. Do you think it's achievable for a body like the UN?
Yeah, I think first we have to congratulate ourselves that after all that, I would say, long and not that easy process, we still managed to come to an agreement. And I would like to stress that it's the first agreement on digital space globally, where we say that these are our principles and we are committed to follow them. But unfortunately, what we also saw throughout this process is that it's increasingly difficult also to come to an agreement. And I would say, I wouldn't call them also issues per se, but there are some areas where we see that we do not entirely agree. And I think these areas specifically will also be challenging in going towards the implementation of the Global Digital Compact or the Pact. And I would like to bring out some of them, and perhaps the first one is actually governance. We have slightly different understandings of what a good governance means for us. And we can definitely say that this multi-stakeholder approach, let's say, to internet governance, data governance, all AI governance, that is a very hot topic at this UNGA. These are not that evident any longer. And we had an opening or a session on the Freedom of Online Coalition the day before yesterday, where Estonia announced its chairship. And then we were also discussing what next. And one of the questions that was actually raised there was a question whether we, as nation states, are also ready to implement the Global Digital Compact. Because it does not just take a global order, it does not just take UN to be ready for it, but all of us who make the UN. Because it takes a lot more than creating a new agency or a new system for the governance of AI. It takes free elections. It takes an independent judicial system. It takes a system for every partner to be involved in our government affairs. And as we see globally, it's not necessarily the case in every country.
So it sounds like there's work to do from the Western countries to convince some states that are on the fence potentially that the open models of digital diplomacy and the internet will be the model for the 21st century. Is that right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that this is just the West-East, North-South divide. This is something we all have to think about. Even in Estonia, how do we make sure that our people, our companies, our universities know what is on stake and are also involved in the process? For example, when we look at the GDC process, we can definitely see that it was still mainly the playground for the usual suspects, big tech companies. I cannot even recall any company from Estonia being involved in this process actively, because it takes quite a bit of resources.
One thing that we were able to talk about backstage was how Estonia's championed resilient models for decentralized data, for digital IDs. Curious about how that'll scale up when you talk about less developed countries that are in the UN that are looking at these models now with the Digital Global Compact and these other things on file.
Yes, I do not know how many people in this audience actually even know about Estonia and what it stands for. So maybe for those who do not know, that Estonia is a very digitalized nation. And I think last week UNDESA again announced the results of the government survey, and we were very proud to rank on top of there. And indeed, we can do almost everything online. I can use a digital signature. I can sell my house. I can get married. I can vote. I can do so many things online. And for years, there was an understanding that it was possible for Estonia because of this Estonia model, how Estonia has digitalized. We have one digital identity. We have a very solid base for our data infrastructure. We have a data governance in place, so we know exactly who collects data, how it is collected, how it is saved, how you can share it, who can access that data, under which conditions, and so forth. But it was all also referred to as something a small country with very well-educated people can do. For example, Estonia has one digital identity that is used across the government, but also across the private sector or anybody. So we have really put our resources together, government and the private sector, to make sure that our digital identity is secure. And that digital identity is used by everybody. Of course, Estonia has 1.3 million people, so it was always alluded as Estonia model and something that you can do with a small number of people. But now we see, for example, India, that has also issued a digital identity for every single person, the country with the biggest population. So I think I was also referring to this example that I sometimes use, that when we have a headache, we know what we need to do, right? Somebody takes aspirin, somebody goes to bed to sleep, reduces stress. I think by now we also know what we need to do to succeed in building an open and secure digital society. So I would say that this decentralized data and the strong digital identity has helped us a lot.
And we certainly see in this happening in the context of a very aggressive Russian hybrid campaign against NATO. In the digital space, you've been experiencing that in Estonia for quite a long time. But I'm just curious how you see this pattern of hybrid attacks, disinformation, even attacks on election systems influencing the future, and how this will affect safeguards for the global community.
Yes, unfortunately, you're right. We witness cyber attacks every day and increasingly. And one trend, I think it was also mentioned in the previous panel, even though I didn't manage to follow it fully, is that we see that it's not only the critical infrastructure that is being attacked. It is actually the services people use every day. Kindergartens. Last year we had a big phishing incident with our kindergartens, schools, universities, dental practices. And this really makes us think how we build our digital society. It's not often so much talked. We talk about cyber capacity, protection of critical infrastructure, or infrastructure generally. But how we actually build our digital society and literacy around it is actually a big question. And of course, I am a digital ambassador, so I work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And how we also tackle these issues. We have realized that these are not just issues of security or defense. As you also mentioned, it cross-cuts with so many other areas: democracy, human rights, trade, economic policy, and also development collaboration. So all of these issues, for example, disinfo, I would say it's more like an umbrella or horizontal issue that we tackle in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, but certainly seems like an issue that is going to be a long-term threat as you're looking at this agenda as well.
Yes, I think this is also why the Global Digital Compact started to come about. It first very much was supposed to focus on opportunities. And unfortunately, it's something that we seem to be forgetting in our conversations. And I am very glad that Estonia is this much-needed reminder that things can actually go also well. Estonia is a well-to-do democratic countries, and partly due to the nature of technologies that do not recognize borders. But of course, indeed, increasingly, we are looking at the threats, and it does not just take one nation or one region, let's say the European Union, that has stepped on regulating and really trying to deal with these threats. It takes a global effort.
Yeah, and on that note, of course, we have about a minute left, Ambassador. I'm curious how you see the global community, the UN, building on this agenda that we've seen at UNGA79 so far.
I think what we have to do, we have to act on the Global Digital Compact, that it wouldn't just remain one of these documents that we write and then it ends up in a drawer or in a shelf. But the question how we go about it is actually a question we are still discussing. We do not actually know what is the best way to continue. Are we going to have an agency? How we are going to involve the different stakeholders in process? So I think that this is still all under debate and not an easy task.
Yeah, certainly. Do you have a way you'd like to see it go from an Estonian perspective?
I would just like to make sure that everybody has a voice there. I come from a small country and a very digitalized nation, and I see that increasingly technological developments take place in a very few countries, and I would say also in private sector hands. So the private sector has a lot more power than many nation states nowadays. So I would really like to see not only all partners being involved, but having the capacity to have a say, because if you don't have an experience, you also actually do not have a voice if you do not know the issues on stake. But I would also like to see the private sector not just taking an active role, and of course we know that business is business. They do it quite a bit for profit, but I would like to see them taking more responsibility and be accountable for this power that they have. We have seen very good partnerships in Estonia. For example, in improving connectivity. Estonia is a small country. We have 1,000 islands. We have local municipalities that have only a few hundred people living. It's evident that private sector, like big telecom companies, they have no interest in going to these places. But we have managed to have different public-private partnerships to get fast and affordable internet to everywhere and start to building this capacity of our public. So this is my hope also for the Global Digital Compact.
Well, it's an ambitious agenda, and we'll be following it very closely. Ambassador Leos, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Please welcome Richard Hatchett, Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, Jean-Bernard Prédeaux, Director General for Health and Nutrition Bureau at Global Affairs Canada, Izumi Nakamitsu, Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations, and Raji Tuundin, Division of Public Health Institutes and Research at Africa CDC for a discussion on innovations in biosecurity and global health.
Everybody. Hello again. It's my distinct honor now to have a discussion with an incredibly illustrious panel on biosecurity and strengthening biosecurity in the age of AI. And as you heard during the introductions, we have just incredible leaders representing multilateral institutions, civil society, and government with us. So let's dive right in. And Richard, I'd love to start with you. You are the head of CEPI, and I know that congratulations are in order because you've just launched a new strategy on biosecurity. So tell us a little bit about that and how you intend to leverage this new strategy for strengthening pandemic preparedness and achieving the 100 Days mission in the age of AI.
Great. No, thank you. And thank you for having me. And thank you for the panel. And thank you all for coming. Let me start. One very quick word about CEPI. We're the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. We're focused on vaccine development for epidemic and pandemic diseases. COVID transformed everything for us, and it certainly elevated concerns about epidemic and infectious disease risk as a category of threat going forward. And all of the vectors that are driving epidemic disease emergence are going really in the wrong direction. So this is a perpetual threat that societies need to be prepared for. And we need to be having an ongoing conversation about developing a bio-risk management infrastructure for the future. The nature of the threats that we face include naturally emerging diseases. I think the questions about COVID origins, whatever your opinion as to what actually happened. Certainly raised questions about lab accidents and releases that are inadvertent. And there's a category of threat, which is deliberate misuse, that we also need to take into account. So the biosecurity infrastructure that we build for the future has to address these three elements. CEPI, as a funding organization, has recognized that we have obligations and responsibilities in terms of the types of research that we support to ensure that we don't add to the collective risk that we all face, and in fact, that we do everything that we can through our funding mechanisms to mitigate that risk. And so we're calling on other funding organizations to step up and take that responsibility. As part of that, over the last year, with the support of Global Affairs Canada and Jean-Bernard, very grateful to Canada for your leadership in this regard, we have established a biosecurity program, and we've been working with stakeholders over the last year to develop a CEPI biosecurity strategy, which we are very happy to roll out today. And let me flash the glossy document. Andrew Hebler, our Director of Biosecurity, who's in the back of the room, carried about 100 of these up and has distributed them around. He doesn't want to carry them home, so let me encourage you all to take these. Very briefly, we've identified 5 areas that we think it's really important to focus on. First is risk identification, understanding the risks that are emerging. The second is to improve the capabilities of our partners who now operate in more than 50 countries, including in the global north and in the global south, to be able to conduct research and development activities safely. The third is to bring a new frame to thinking about biosecurity, particularly in the age of AI, which is going to radically democratize the ability of scientists around the world to do important innovation, and to recognize that there is a very important link between biosecurity standards and safety and achieving our goals relating to equity. The fourth goal, I'm going to have to check my list, is really just to recognize that we have converging risks. We have an increasing number of BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs. Just in the US, there are over 1,600 BSL-3 laboratories. And there are BSL-4 laboratories now in almost 30 countries around the world. So that's one element of risk. AI is an element of risk. Increasing research and development and evolution of tools of biology and increasing risk. These things are all converging. And we've got to monitor that and appreciate that. And then the last area where I think CEPI as a funder is particularly well positioned as we step up into this responsibility is to recognize that we can also accelerate innovation to achieve our biosecurity and biosafety goals, and we need to invest appropriately, just like our partners in cyber have been investing in developing cybersecurity tools. We need to be developing biosecurity tools.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I appreciate you so clearly articulating what those 5 pillars are and how they're interconnected. And Izumi, I'd love to bring you in on the conversation at this point. You know, at the Office of Disarmament Affairs, one of the key areas of your work is exactly understanding and addressing within the UN system and with member states how AI and other emerging technologies are shaping the mitigation of biosecurity risks, but also how to leverage that new technology to strengthen preparedness. So tell us a little bit about what are your priorities in this regard, and how are you working with within the UN and external partners?
Right. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this. And I took notes of all these 5 points, which all we agree with. One thing I wanted to start with is, and I brought this because I wanted to read out, the Pact for the Future, which we developed, and it was a difficult negotiation by member states. But in that pact, which was just adopted Sunday, negotiations continued until early hours of that day in the morning. But that pact actually includes the language as follows. Action 26, address emerging and evolving biological risks through improving processes to anticipate, prevent, coordinate, and prepare for such risks, whether caused by natural, accidental, or deliberate release of biological agents. And then the next one goes on to say, identify, examine, and develop effective measures, including possible legally binding measures, to strengthen and institutionalize international norms and instruments against the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, retention, and use of biological agents and toxins as weapons. And in a little bit later in the same text, you also acknowledge how the international community, member states, and the UN need to leverage science and technology to make sure that these risks are also countered and also maximize the benefit of those science and technology. Why am I saying this? One, because we worked very hard to have this language. It's a member states-led process, of course. But our role as the UN Secretariat is to provide options. Number one, identify the emerging risks. And as already mentioned, innovations, really rapid development in science and technology actually is creating new challenges, really difficult challenges, which could only be actually addressed through partnership by various entities, not just governments, but also multi-stakeholder people, including industry, private sector, researchers themselves, bring all these different perspectives together and make sure that they will be a process. Now we actually do have a commitment by member states in the form of a pact that we could actually start and create such a process. So my first message actually is to let's capitalize on this commitment by member states of the United Nations and think about what kind of a process that could be useful and indeed effective to counter those new and emerging challenges. My second is we have an old instrument called Biological Weapons Convention that goes back to 1972. There have been also some positive developments in that framework. We support the discussions there as well. They have been able to establish working groups. And one of the issues that they are really concretizing is to look at scientific advancement and how those things actually impact the really hardcore biological security in the military sense. And there have been quite interesting discussions taking place. There are already some interesting different institutional models for scientific board type of arrangement under the framework of the Biological Weapons Convention. And hopefully it will be member states or the states parties of that convention will be able to decide to actually create such a biological weapons convention scientific monitoring board. And then the third is, of course, the AI, Secretary General's AI, independent AI body, which released a thick report. I invite you all to actually take a look at it, at least the executive summary part. They are recommending that we move to actually start creating a light form of, governance frameworks. We need to make advancement so that there will be a clear sort of understanding at the level of the international community. And that includes, obviously, private sector entities. Those are entities that are developing artificial intelligence to start identifying red lines and guardrails. And those developments actually need to be combined together with the BWC and, of course, the pact, now that there is a concrete possibility of creating, if you will, interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder partnership sort of platform to have concrete discussions, what it is that we need to do to address the biosecurity. And then from the UN internal, since 2020, we have already been working. There is an interagency working group on biosecurity, and I co-chair that with WHO. And we have been already preparing, if you will, a form of SOPs in the event of something, serious biosecurity incidents. This is how the UN entities, including, of course, the peace and security parts, health, WHO, humanitarian entities, and would operationalize the response. So that sort of reaction phase is already being done. Now is the time we can now move towards how to prevent such a major incident. So let's capitalize on the Pact for the Future.
No, that's fantastic, and I really appreciate those updates. And just to underscore, achieving that language is no small feat. It takes enormous negotiations and consensus to be able to get that. And as you said, paired with BWC. But I think the last point that you made is a really important one, which is we have these things in principle, the strategy, the pact, the BWC. How do we actually ensure that it's operationalized? And this is where, Taj, I'd love to bring you into the conversation, because the Africa CDC is really on the forefront of important efforts to strengthen biosecurity and biosafety, and to do much of the work that Izumi and Richard were talking about, anticipating, identifying, outreach, and so much more. But of course, all of this requires collaboration and it requires resourcing. And so I'd love to ask you a little bit about, especially in low-resourced settings or under-resourced settings, can you share some innovative strategies that are promising, and what kinds of partnerships, especially across sectors, are needed to ensure that there's access and equity when it comes to operationalizing these biosafety and biosecurity measures?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for those questions, and greetings to my fellow panelists, and greetings from Dr. Gian Castea, who I would actually love to be part of this discussion, because when it comes to biosecurity, biosafety, I think it's something that is very close to his heart, and it's a top agenda for Africa CDC. Now, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been following the event happening on the continent of Africa, you will observe that for the past 5 years, we've been having, on the average, more than 100 infectious disease outbreak per annum. Last year alone, it was around 156. And the ongoing multi-country mpox outbreak attests to that. Now, for us to significantly reduce this repeated, recurrent infectious disease outbreak, there's need for early warning, there's need for immediate response, and of course, there's also a need for coordination, and that explains why, in the context of the mpox, the Africa CDC, first and foremost, declared that mpox a public health emergency of continental security, first of its kind in our 8 years of history. And that was followed, a day after, by public health emergency of international concern by WHO. So, colleagues, given the context of what is happening on the continent, so there's need for us to really come up with a very robust biosecurity and biosafety agenda, And for us to do that, we know that there are certain things, there are certain partnerships, there are certain collaboration, coordination, communication, and cooperation that need to go into that space, and I think, let me, at this juncture, thank our colleague from Global Affairs in Canada, who have been part and parcel of this journey with Africa CDC, and therefore Richard, for this biosecurity strategy that was recently launched. I think Africa CDC will be very pleased to work with you, to make sure that we implement that strategy. Now, let me go into specifics. Since the issue of biosecurity and biosafety became a very top issue for Africa CDC, so we've started working with our member states. We want to make sure that we strengthen those institutions who are going to be at the forefront of biosecurity. Mm-hmm. Number two, we also continue to build capacity, as far as that space is concerned. Number three is to leverage the political leadership on the continent. If there is any advantage that Africa CDC will bring into this space, is the fact that we are a technical institution that sits within an intergovernmental political organization called the African Union. So meaning that we can leverage at the highest political level, talking of our head of state and government. I think we also bring that into the space. Of course, number four is around resource mobilization, because all this effort will be nothing without adequate financing. So again, to complement what is coming from the global north and some of our partners, we are also looking inward, because President Paul Kagame has rightly said, you cannot guarantee a security through goodwill alone. So you need to be more proactive. You need to look inward. And in this regard, Africa CDC is working with our member states to mobilize adequate resources to be able to do that. Last but not the least is around respected, action-oriented partnerships. You know, and I think we can also frame this around what we call the Lusaka agenda. You know, whereby it's not just to coming from the globe to tell us what to do, is what to sit down, co-create this agenda together, you know, and really come up with what is it that is appropriate to the local context, you know, because we are talking of leveraging biotechnology in this space, you know. So really, for Africa CDs, it is a big agenda for us, and we're more than glad to work with all the partners who are working in this space to make sure that we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I want to pick up on your emphasis on partnerships. And this is something that Richard touched on and Izumi touched on. And it's so important if you actually want to have implementation of any of these principles and goals. And so, Jean-Bernard, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. And Global Affairs Canada has really made biosafety and biosecurity a priority on your agenda in terms of how you're working with multilateral institutions, civil society organizations, and of course governments around the world. And so I'd love to know from you, when it comes to strengthening global health, security, and pandemic preparedness, why has this been such a top priority for Global Affairs Canada in terms of investments and partnerships? And what are some of the notable impacts of the initiatives that you've been able to forge?
Thank you for the question. First thing I'll say, I've been a development practitioner for a few decades now. I'm approaching the programming we fund through the health and nutrition side. So we've been brought progressively at this nexus between health, security, and global health. And I think it's the right moment to do that. We're at some sort of inflection point when I listen to Richard and the other panelists. We have those innovations coming up, technology as well, that allow us to intervene, to be better prepared, to better respond as well to all the threats that we face. Obviously, I'll repeat what everybody says. Since COVID-19, we need to do better. We need to be faster as well as we develop new tools to be ready for the next infectious diseases. I'll focus a little bit on our partnership with CEPI. We've been a strong supporter of the organization for some time. We've bought in the 100 days mission as well, and all the goals that are laid out in the CEPI 2.0 strategic plan. Canada will be providing 100 million towards advancing CEPI's strategic objective. We do that because we're a strong believer in multi-sectoral approaches to address security threats. This is the approach we've been taking in our partnership with CEPI so far. And we do it through two different channels. So it takes me back to this nexus between health and security. So our early support for CEPI and for its biosecurity work was provided through funding from Canada's international security programs. And our broader support for the 2.0 strategy is channeled through our global health commitments. And in doing that, we work really closely with several other federal departments as well. The rise of AI was mentioned. We have more sophisticated vaccine technologies. So we must be prepared to take advantage of what those technologies bring. But as Richard said quite clearly, we need to be prepared as well for the risk that those pose to us. So it's really in this context that Canada's Weapons Threat Reduction Program, which is Canada's contribution to the G7-led Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, has been a proud supporter of CEPI's efforts since 2017 now. And it's through that support we've been able to support getting to this flashy new document that was shown by Richard. CEPI's leadership as well in addressing biosafety and biosecurity within their work, that's what gave us confidence to continue the partnership with them, really. Something we appreciate as well is the focus on emerging biotechnology and converging technology, while at the same time accelerating innovation in this space. The last thing I'll insist on, one thing we appreciate in the partnership is the recognition of equity as being really critical for biosafety and biosecurity. That's something that is really in line with the spirit of the Pact for the Future. It does respond to expectations from Africa CDC, other partners in Africa and elsewhere as well. So this idea of co-creation, this idea of having coherent approach in the spirit of the Lusaka agenda as well that was mentioned is truly important for Canada.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, I wanted to pick up on this point about equity and access as well. And we're almost out of time, but I want to ask one last question to all of you. And I'd love if we could go very quickly down the line. But as we, are here on the margins of the Summit of the Future and of the UN General Assembly, what do you all see as the top priorities when it comes to ensuring that the deployment of AI for biosafety and biosecurity is ethical, that it's equitable, and that it's sustainable? And so maybe, Izumi, we'll start with you and then very quickly work down the line. And Richard, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, if you ask me just one,
yes,
then I think the key word is responsible design, development, deployment, and use of artificial intelligence throughout the life cycle. We can't restrict the technologies themselves, and it's not, ideal to do that anyways. Which means that we need to make sure that upstream everyone understands, including the engineers and private sectors that are developing those, understand that responsibility notion clearly from the beginning. And I think that has to be really across the board. And that responsibility obviously also includes the notion of access, the equitable access, etc. I mean, the first, the best first sort of line of defense, if something really bad happens, is also, it's prevention, but it's also, effective public health response. So that really means that the divide between the North and South, if you will, is bridged. And that would actually benefit all of us. So I think that notion of equitable access is really important, that we need to make sure.
Yeah, great. Taj?
Thank you. I think for me, I would start with governance. Governance in such a way that nobody is left behind. Now, tied to that governance is the digital divide. How do we ensure that when we begin to reap the benefits of this AI, it's not just one part of the world, that is going to gain maximally, and the other part of the world is going to wait 10 years before they begin to benefit from that. Yeah. So let's find a way to really break that digital divide. And last but not the least, the continent of Africa currently, when it comes to mobile phone penetration, we're talking of 80%. When you talk of internet access, we are talking of 50%. How do we leverage? This is a big opportunity. How do we leverage that to drive this AI agenda? Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, one thing I would add is that equity has to be concrete. So we need to come up together with concrete programs that allow it to be demonstrated in real life. We do it Canada with many other partners, for example, in growing our portfolio of initiatives, bringing vaccine production capacity closer to population around the globe. We do it through the mRNA Technology Transfer and Manufacturing Hub program in South Africa, PAO's manufacturing platform, and Gavi's African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator as well, are all examples of what equity really means in terms of actual programming.
Great. And finally, Richard?
I would just say that equity is not just about giving or flowing down or allocating from the center. It's about collective ownership. And the problem of biosecurity needs to be treated like other security problems that we collectively as society have solved, fire security, maybe not solved, but are dealing with, fire security, cybersecurity. Responsibility in those areas is distributed across the public sector, the private sector, government, non-governmental organizations. Innovation is being driven by free market systems, and we need to get there with biosecurity as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to each of you for those call to actions and, again, the work that you're doing in your respective institutions, but also with each other and in partnership. It's great to be with you, and I wish you all the best as you carry this work forward and implement your new strategies and pacts and really operationalize all of the commitments we've discussed. Thank you so much. Izumi, Taj, Jean-Bernard, and Richard.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Bosun Tijani, Minister of Communications, Innovation, and Digital Economy for the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and Nabia Syed, Executive Director at the Mozilla Foundation, for a discussion with Foreign Policy's Dr. Maisha Alam on accelerating inclusive global connectivity and progress toward the SDGs.
Hello again. We're going to pick up on many of the themes that we were actually touching on in the previous segment, but broaden our focus a little bit and really discuss how we can go about accelerating inclusive global connectivity and progress when it comes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the deadline for that is 2030. It's fast approaching. Next year is going to be a really important year in terms of reflecting, redoubling efforts, and course correcting. And it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with both of you about these issues. And so let's dive right in. And Minister, I would love to start with you in particular. You are the Minister of Communications and Innovation and Digital Economy for Nigeria. Tell us a little bit about how can Nigeria and the broader African continent, in terms of leading developing AI and guardrails, play a role when it comes to closing the digital divide. How are you addressing these issues within your country and making sure that the work is done in a way that's equitable and sustainable?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I think the starting point is for us to truly operationalize the word inclusion. I think most of the time when it comes to technology and any form of technology, I think inclusion is right up there. You give it to the world for always attempting to ensure that no one is left behind, whether you're talking about connectivity or more recently artificial intelligence. But I think the key thing is understanding that inclusion is not inclusion if it doesn't add value to our world. Right. There's a reason why we believe inclusion is good. Our world is complete, it's beautiful when we carry everyone along. And I think if you take that into consideration, is why we need to truly remind ourselves that the emerging technologies that we're all building and pushing is literally reshaping our world. It's building a new future for humanity. Artificial intelligence, already so, but more so in the future, will determine how we think, what we think, how we do our work, how we interact. And if that's the case, it's not an option that certain parts of the world is not carried along. So for us, I think we looked at that from a productive perspective, and we say to ourselves, whilst countries like Nigeria may be late to the development of artificial intelligence, for instance, there's still an opportunity for us to actively participate in fully building it. Mm-hmm. People may think it's done. AI would require that we all document what we know for it to function effectively. And if people are talking about, for instance, inclusion in AI data set, we're not going to wait for OpenAI to come and help us digitize our reality, which I think is an opportunity for countries like Nigeria, because there's so much about us that the rest of the world needs to know. I don't know how many people in the room is aware of Burna Boy. Anyone aware of Burna Boy? Let me see your hands. I think, yeah, quite a number of people. Do you know half of what he says? Fantastic. So, and the reality is the Nigerian language is not as straightforward. So even if we document it, it's not straightforward for AI to just be able to tell you what Burna is saying, because there are nuances to the way we translate and interpret the things that we say in our language. So imagine if we can actually help the process of digitizing that reality and bringing it to AI to be able to help you enjoy Burna better. And there's so much in that. So there's economic value in it. There's the aspect of the culture and the language that we bring to it and ensure that the inclusivity that we talk about is truly rich. So I think it's important from that perspective that we don't think we're late to the game. That's what we're doing in Nigeria. You know, Global South shouldn't think we're late to the game. It's a phenomenon that the basic and the core science of it has been developed elsewhere. But to truly appropriate it for humanity, we need everyone to participate in making it full. Yeah. And that's the economic opportunity. So if you look at a continent like ours, where probably 70% of our people are under the age of 30, and it's been projected that the significant portion of global workforce is going to come from Africa. There's nothing the world can do to stop that at the minute. So why wouldn't we want to engage such population to ensure that the world we're building includes their reality?
Well, and just to pick up on a couple of things that you said, you know, it's as much about the right thing to do as it is the smart thing to do, but it's also about partnerships and understanding the variety of stakeholders that are relevant to actually making this happen. And so, Nabiha, I'd love to bring you in on the conversation. And you had the Mozilla Foundation, and in that role and over the course of your career, you know, you've had to figure out how to collaborate across civil society, academia, industry. And so tell us a little bit about, you know, when it comes to unlocking AI's potential, investing in digital infrastructure and establishing ethical AI frameworks, how do we achieve inclusion from your perspective? What's it going to take? And what role does data play in terms of advancing those objectives? Data was something the minister mentioned as well.
I love this question. Good morning, everybody. When we look at civil society, philanthropy, and academia, they have two superpowers. The first is that if they're doing things correctly, they're there to serve the public. Necessarily, they are thinking about inclusion because there is a public logic. The second is that they can be patient. Commercial interests operate on a tighter timeline. You have investors to answer to, you have shareholders. And so between serving the public and the capability of being patient, we have a different set of incentives, right? And I think actually having competing incentives to commercial incentives are useful in the development of any technology that, like AI, that we are presuming will revolutionize the world, right? And so how do we give life to those incentives? How do we give life to that collaboration? For the Mozilla Foundation, with its partners, we've invested $75 million over the last 5 years towards the cause of trustworthy AI. And for us, inclusivity in data sets is of utmost importance, right? The models are the models, and we should talk about inclusion across the stack and openness across the stack, but we know that the data is what really matters, and I love that you brought up language and voice. For us, one of our landmark projects is, since 2017, we've had a project called Common Voice, based on a very simple observation that you raised, which is the languages, the voices of the world should be represented in data sets, not just English, French, Mandarin, and Spanish, right? We should have more than that.
Yeah.
And so we, since 2017, have built the world's largest open source voice data set of 100 different languages, but not by doing what OpenAI and others might do, not by scraping what we can find available. Instead, we will go to places like Borneo, where our chief researcher on this just went, and we'll sit with communities and say, we want to hear your language, to preserve it in this data set for the culture. We will publish it as open source so your innovators and anyone who wants to honor your culture can use this to build, right? Our job is to collaborate to create the building blocks of that kind of future. And in that collaboration, we're seeing industry use our open source data set too, right? And so the role of these sort of publicly minded, patient actors can be to make these building blocks that are actually inclusive, that can challenge industry too, to say, well, if we can do it, step it up, right? Let's get as many as we can. And we have, Minister, we have Yoruba and Hausa and a couple other languages, but you don't have to go to OpenAI to get that. You can talk to Mozilla. We can make that bigger.
Well, I think, the point that you make about there are different approaches to doing this, and if you are intentional about inclusion at the get-go, the results that you're going to achieve are going to be very different, right? And the impacts are going to be different is a point that's really, really well taken. Something that I've been thinking about as I'm listening to both of you speak, and it's a question for you both to chime in on, is there's so many different considerations that need to be balanced when it comes to these issues. And so, as countries are developing AI capacities and corresponding guardrails and safeguards, what is the right balance between maintaining trade privacy and competitive advantage? And as you were saying, both the incentives as well as, the consequences, if you will, when it comes to the necessary transparency and regulations to operate at the same time. Maybe Nabiha, I'll go to you first and then give the minister the last word.
Sure. When we talk about balance, we should talk about humility too, about what we don't know about this technology. We don't yet know the fullest of its applications. We don't yet know exactly where innovation will come from. We shouldn't presume that it will only come from the West. We also don't fully know the harms, right? And openness and open source, I think, is the salve for each of those three things for us to muddle through to some kind of balance. On the first, if you take a different revolution, if you look at, the advent of printing in Korea and China, and then the printing press in the 1400s, and then the rise of investigative journalism, and then Twitter, the through line between those things was not clear at the outset, right? So what assumptions are we making right now about the development of how the technology will go because of an impatience, because of the interconnectivity that we have, because we want to know? We don't know. So open source, openness, allows many people to participate in the creation of that future. In terms of where the innovation comes from, it's never lost on me that M-Pesa predated Apple Pay by 7 years. Right. So let us not forget that creativity and innovation can come from anywhere. And the last, which is we don't know what the harms are. Yeah. We truly do not yet know what the harms are because we don't know all of the ways in which it will unfold. We need a level of openness and open source across the stack, including the data sets, the models, the model weights. There's a lot of discussion over definitions of open source, to allow researchers, civil society, academics to interrogate these systems, to identify harm wherever it takes root, so we can then solve that. And I think open source is going to be the way that we get to the balance we need.
Right. No, absolutely. I think open source, but we also still need to understand that this phenomenon is expensive. Mm-hmm. Right, so it has to be funded. And I think for Global South, going full open source probably doesn't guarantee that we'll always have resources to develop it. So in Nigeria, for instance, we've set up something called the AI Collective, which is funded by Luminate. And the idea is that we can pool resources, pool folks from civil society, the private sector, government, academia, to start to continue to work on AI, its development, ensuring its safety in society. But also generally just bearing in mind that for Global South, you don't have the luxury of government having the depth of knowledge like you have in Global North. That's just the reality across Global South. So when you have this large community, you ensure that you continue to build. But the other thing we've realized, however, is that we still need resources. That AI Collective, you have to keep begging Mozilla for money, Google for money, all over the place. So what we're doing is we're actually building our large language model. And we're toying with an idea of a national AI trust that says that we will collect the data set. It will be an open data set, but we have to vet who is using it. Yeah. So you will contribute or donate to a trust that is held for the country. So if OpenAI decides they want to use our data set, we'll have different models. They will contribute to the trust. And the funds in the trust is what we'll use to continue to develop artificial intelligence for the benefit of society. So I think we need to be open to business model. The idea of open source is ensuring that the data set can help us improve AI. That's what it is. But there may be balance that we can strike that will ensure that countries continue to build without throwing everything they have on their competitive edge away.
Well, thank you for both your perspectives. And as I'm listening to you speak, I am struck that there are really no easy answers, and we're figuring it out as we go, but we have to be responsible and intentional about it. And I think that's been a common undercurrent to both of your comments. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on the work that you're doing. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Nabiha.
Thank you.
Please welcome Alvin Bowles, Global Business Group Vice President at Meta, and Tim Fu, Architect and Designer, for a conversation with Foreign Policy's Ravi Agarwal on artificial intelligence and the creative economy.
Okay, good to be back. How's everyone doing? Good, good. Okay, well, I have a wonderful panel here, Alvin Bowles and Tim Fu, and also a really fun topic to talk about creativity. Alvin, I think I'll start with you. You already won me over by telling me you just read my book, so you get
butter him up.
You get the easy questions, Tim. Sorry, you're in the doghouse.
Sure.
Alvin, when you think about creativity and AI, where does your mind go?
It's one, thank you for being here and thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it. I think essentially creativity is still human. It is a human activity. And I think that technology is really just meant to enable us focusing on this notion of decreasing the distance between ideation and outcomes. Being able to do this collaboratively, I think, is allowing us to be able to democratize outcomes. That's part of what we do at Meta. The platform is really invented, that and Instagram, to democratize storytelling and also outcomes. So we work with large businesses, we obviously work with small businesses and creators of all different sizes and shapes, and obviously every sort of socioeconomic and geographic opportunity. And it's really meant to be able to enable those individuals to be able to get their voices heard and develop audiences should they want to be able to do so. So I think about technology as really an enabler in many respects. And I do think that in order for us to focus on what's next, it's really making sure that we're actually focusing on participation and access.
Yeah. Tim, what about you? I mean, you're the most creatively dressed of us.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit about what you do and how you come into this topic.
Yeah, the part that is relevant is, I guess, I started becoming viral, let's just call it that, when I started to work with artificial intelligence on social media, like Instagram, with Meta. And then, from then on, we started to showcase a lot of the capabilities of artificial intelligence in the creative realm, such as designing buildings, architectural typologies, all the way to urbanisms and interior design. And so from this aspect, I found an opportunity to use this new tool for the advantages that we as a creative industry can hold. And so from then on, I guess Meta reached out, I became creative partner, and then at some point, OpenAI reached out, and now recently NVIDIA as well. So you can say that it's been democratizing a lot of us in the industry, especially many of us who are younger in the architectural industry. As they say, architecture is a late bloomers industry. You don't really get a lot of prolific works out until later in life. So, the ability for the use of social media as a platform as well as AI enabled this new way for us, I feel, to succeed as creatives in this industry who are still young.
Alvin, a sort of recurring theme through our discussions today is about haves and have-nots, the digital divide globally. I know you travel all over the world. What do you think a company like yours can do to bridge that gap? Because, we heard earlier, 2.6 billion people are not even connected online. That is an audience you necessarily cannot reach. And then there are audiences that are online, but not properly, so not with the right tools, certainly not with the right digital literacy. And there are very real fears about bringing people into the online world safely.
Yes.
I'll be honest and say your company does not have the best history on that topic. How are you thinking about it now?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think that a lot of this is making sure that we're learning from those challenges. I think that, you know, Meta is a 21-year-old company. It's important to remember that. And that as we think through testing and iterating, our policies have had to evolve. A lot of the things that govern our activity were laws that were invented before the internet even existed. And so as we're thinking through what that actually looks like, it's really trying to make sure that we're providing accessibility to individuals and also giving them the protections that they need. And we're making sure we're doing this collaboratively. Particularly on the AI side of it, it's the AI Alliance, and making sure we understand how do we actually learn from individuals that are super users, people that are casual users, people that are actually understanding what's the best way for us to focus on copyright and all these different types of opportunities regarding intellectual property. So while you're bringing people onto the platform, you also want to make sure you're protecting their likeness, protecting all of the content that they're putting out there, and then ensuring that they actually have all the protections in place to then decide what best to do with it. That's not really for us. We're an enabler tool. It's not necessarily looking for us to actually develop outcomes. We're enabling outcomes in those respects.
And how do you build trust? And again, I say this because there is, rightfully so, around the world, a fear that, you know, companies have financial imperatives. They compete against each other, but many of them also have monopolistic tendencies. I mean, they want you to use their products. That's their first mission. How do you get around that to actually build trust and be seen as an actor that, you know, people who are coming online or creatives who are online should actually look to you as a trustworthy source to partner with?
I think it's partnering with individuals like this, being able to understand how best to give people the tools to have access, and then understanding how they're utilizing it. One of the examples that I'm sure that he's talking about here is just being able to actually focus on giving people an opportunity to discover his talent and being able to actually develop economic outcomes for himself. And I do think that there's an opportunity for us to think through how do we actually ensure that we're actually being consistent with our policies, being transparent associated with that. You know, we've really focused on trying to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can, and actually to work collaboratively with lawmakers from all different geographic regions to ensure that we're actually not changing laws, if you will, but adhering to the ones that exist. And then also pushing the boundaries on understanding what do people want to leverage our products for. You know, it's also important to understand that we're also providing products for communication tools. I think about WhatsApp, and that as an opportunity for it. We're not necessarily focusing on monetization for that type of opportunity. That's really a communications tool. And 3 billion people a day use that, but it's offering really opportunities for individuals to keep communities close together, not necessarily for monetization.
Yeah. Tim, on that question of trust, how are you thinking about it as an individual who's partnering with Meta here? What do you think they could do more to build trust among creatives?
I think it's possibly helpful to understand the data sets and pools of which it's obtained its training data, at the very least. I think there's a lot of things we can do to make it more comfortable for the artists to know that, okay, this is not private data that is not should not be accessible. And then I think we should also just have transparency throughout the whole process from the beginning to the end. I can't say personally too much on this regard because, I like to just look at opportunities rather than vulnerabilities. In my perspective, as the artist and the creator, when a new tool comes, you want to first explore all the possibilities first before you start to criticize the hindrances that you should put forth. And for technologies like these, I think there's a lot of people that speaks about, stopping certain AI's involvement or data set restrictions. But we are the creative team that is trying to push this technology to build actual physical buildings in which you can actually step inside next year, So that's an opportunity. And these opportunities require us to fully utilize the potential of these tools, which means, yes, it's going to be a bit fuzzy at this point in time, but by the end of the day, if we ever talk about IP, what type of, how is the world of IP going to revolve now in this new era of AI, which to me, I believe will need rethinking as opposed to the past paradigm.
Can I build on that for a second?
Please.
I think one of the things that we launched in 2023 is our Rights Manager product, and giving individuals that log onto our platforms the ability to then set parameters on what they want shared, what they want utilized, and giving the power to those individuals. So I think that it's a real tangible example for us listening to the market, listening to consumers, and also making sure that individuals like Tim have this discoverability. You know, the idea is that you're actually putting your content out there to be discovered in many respects, or finding an audience, but also not having to sacrifice. You know, there doesn't have to be a competition between personalization and privacy. That is, those things should be harmonious in many respects. And yes, we will likely continue to see individuals leverage the tools in ways that we actually haven't thought of. And we've got to make sure that then our sort of rules and regulations that sit on top of that still allow those outcomes to actually be pervasive across the platform. So we're really excited about that, but we're also really excited about being able to actually partner with government and legal entities to ensure that these policies really enable real creativity and innovation. Like, that's the reason why we exist.
So there's creativity for sure through what you do, through what we see that AI is capable of. There's also creative destruction. And I'm thinking about jobs here. AI is going to create many jobs, it's going to destroy many jobs. What do you think the responsibility of the private sector is as it thinks about that potential?
Well, I think that it's a really important question. What I've said in general is that creativity and technology is essentially human, and the humans that use it. And so if we're focusing on trying to leverage technology to give people more time for the things that are actually really creative, one of the examples that Tim just gave was, well, photography didn't kill painting. It was a different medium, a different canvas in which to paint. And so can we actually look at this in the same way? So in dealing with creative agencies and creatives, we're not necessarily asking individuals to give up their entire creative or creativity to the technology, but spending time on that creative brief and then allowing the technology to give them more time back to then really actually be creative. You think about the mundane tasks that are in your everyday lives that technology still gives you time back. That's the way we tend to think about it.
You know, one of my best friends is a painter, and he actually now paints his paintings on an iPad. And it's amazing what he can do with it. And then he recreates it, you know, on a proper canvas, and it's actually boosted his creativity. Tim, I'm going to give you the last word. You mentioned earlier that through AI you can sort of design the buildings that we'll be walking in next year. Leave us with a big thought that will sort of blow us away. What is coming up?
No pressure.
on the creativity front that someone like I wouldn't know anything about?
AI is like a technology that is revolutionary. It's not a small feat. It's pretty much like the Industrial Revolution, or when we discovered the internet, had the internet boom. I believe we are opening a new Pandora's box of possibilities, because this technology can build itself, can train itself, and can improve itself, and can now dominate in the creative industry, which, you know, throughout the Industrial Revolution, that was never the case until later on. So I think that we are going to see a fundamental shift in every sector, in every field, especially in the creative industry, which we already are in the process of. You know, as they say, many people destroy some jobs because of this technology. Yes, all new technologies that come will destroy jobs. That's a fact. But what is also a fact is I started this office, you know, end of last year, and now we're 10 people. And that growth is, you know, something that's facilitated by our use and adapting of this technology. You can argue that I've also created jobs by putting in the job description expert prompt crafters, you know, architects with knowledge that of using AI to design, or people that can manage data sets. So, you know, when it comes to new tools and technologies, you have to learn to adapt and create opportunities, which means creating new jobs. You know, photography was not a job before photography, but now it is. So I'm very certain that a new set of jobs are going to exist, and we're going to see the world rapidly revolve into this new era that I call the era of AI.
And now everyone's a photographer. Tim, Alvin, thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Real pleasure.
Please welcome Anna Makanju, Vice President of Global Impact at OpenAI, for a discussion on the future of global AI governance.
Okay, Anna Makanji, you are our final guest today. No pressure. Now, you used to work in government at the NSC, and I feel like I could have an entire conversation with you about that side of your life. But given that you've now worked in public sector and private sector, I'm curious how you're thinking about the public-private divide when it comes to regulating AI and conversations around AI.
I do think it's an incredibly unusual situation to have a technology with this level of impact that is being developed entirely in the private sector. And I think governments are starting to grapple with that and what that means. But what I think, I think that there are three things that are really important. One of them being that what we have seen in this technology is that governance really should focus on outcomes. Because when there have been some regulatory interventions where governments have tried to focus on the way the technology is developed, and I think that would be a real mistake. With our newest model, for example, O1, if anyone has tried it, one thing that we discovered is that it's incredibly good at following the safety instructions much better than any previous model. And so if we had frozen, our previous safety interventions in regulation, we would have been implementing those instead of ones that are much more impactful.
Interesting. Wow. But in this whole discussion about not stifling innovation while still somehow creating guardrails, I guess one thing I keep coming back to is, in the earlier iterations of this conversation a decade ago, 15 years ago at the birth of the internet, the world wasn't able to regulate in the way that it should have, with hindsight. And what are the mistakes we made then that we should avoid making today?
So I think one thing that is encouraging is that we have learned from those mistakes. For example, from very early on, we were quite focused on any negative impact that we would see on the democratic process. And we put in place several teams that actually think about this and act, and we've seen them be quite effective. You might have seen we've taken down several influence operations by state actors. And we were, so we were prepared for that. But I do think it would also be a real mistake to think about this technology through the lens of social media, which often happens because both the risks that it poses and the incredible opportunities, and the way the technology itself is constructed are so incredibly different.
Do you see OpenAI now still as a startup, or are you legitimately big tech?
I know I think, we, of course, are really cognizant of the profound impact that our tools have had, but we are still a very small company. We are, we are sort of discussed in the same sentence as like Google or Microsoft, but we are at 2,000 people, a tiny fraction of these are companies that have been around for 25 years and have 250,000 employees. But nonetheless, we know that this technology is going to have really profound impact on people's lives. It's part of the reason that my job exists, is because we understand the responsibility that we have. And we are working very hard to make sure this technology actually does have benefits for as many people as possible.
One of the things that comes up every year at UNGA is that there's a sense that the action, to some degree, is often moving away. So, yes, you've got every single country represented here, but a lot of big policy gets legislated now at the G7 or the G20. And again, in your previous roles in the White House, you must be so aware of this from multiple levels. Now that you're at OpenAI, how do you think about, conversations about regulation? Are they being dominated by the big players?
Of course, the US and the EU have had a really outsized role in setting the tone for regulatory conversations. But, you can actually feel it at this General Assembly, is that countries are very focused on making sure that they're part of this conversation. And I think actually, even, you saw this event that Secretary Blinken did. I think that there's an awareness of the fact that this conversation has to be inclusive because of the incredible global impact of this technology. And I think one of the things that, one of the reasons my job exists is because there certainly is a risk, is that if we do not act, that this technology's impact is going to be uneven, that it might actually exacerbate some of the existing inequalities. And so we have to be really intentional about governance. And I actually think that there's an unprecedented recognition of that.
Yeah. So you use the word inclusive there, and I'm curious what the exclusions are. And again, if you put on your old NSC Russia hat, I mean, you understand how hard it is to cooperate with Russia on anything at the UN or elsewhere in this current moment. Where does AI fit into that? How do you trust across the table, countries that you want to join in, building guardrails and in creating proper regulation, and yet you really can't trust them? How does that add up?
I mean, it's an incredibly, this is one of the biggest challenges I think we have as a global community in relation to this technology, because we know that there are certain potential very serious risks from the advancement of this technology. But I do think, as someone who worked in Russia for many years, even at the worst sort of parts of the relationship between the United States and Russia, they managed to maintain agreement on nuclear weapons. And so I think that where...
That's fraying now.
I mean, it's fraying, but it has not collapsed. And I understand that there is... this is probably the worst... the worst state that the regime has ever been in. But nonetheless, I think for this technology, there is a recognition. You've seen China actually come out and be quite proactive about their view that they do want some global regime around, the most serious risks of AI. I think that we can't give up on trying to come to some sort of agreement around those risks.
All of us are currently just obsessed with November 5 and its impacts on America and the world. How are you thinking about AI and cybersecurity and electoral integrity?
I mean, we've actually been able to use the tools we've built to strengthen the cybersecurity of our systems significantly. So these tools do have a lot of advantages for defenders. And this is one of the reasons that we really think that the US government and other governments should be moving faster in integrating them for their own defense. I think the other thing we've seen, I mean, this may not be the case forever, but our own investigative teams have been able to move much faster to identify any kind of election interference on the platform because they are now able to review, millions of interactions in a fraction of the time. And we have investigators that have worked in traditional methods. They say that something would have taken them 2 weeks, they can now do in about an hour. So we can find this much faster.
But malactors can use the same tools.
Well, we're seeing what they're doing, right? Because this investigative team is looking at what bad actors are doing on the platform. And I think much like everyone else, they're not very good at using the technology yet. And we are ahead of them because we have already put in place this framework and we are seeing what they're doing. And they're struggling. Obviously, that will not be the case forever, but at least for November 5th, it really seems like this technology is not going to be a significant factor in that election.
From your lips to God's ears, I hope you're right. Anna Makanju from OpenAI, thank you very much. Your pleasure. And I think that is that for FP's Tech Forum. Thank you for staying with us again. I know how busy you are this week and this morning. Just a couple of quick things. I want to thank our partners, of course, and they are CEPI, Luminate, Microsoft, Meta, and Regulating AI. There's much more to come at this very venue. If you'd like to come back and stick around, we have an event later this afternoon on the intersection of healthcare and climate. There are two fantastic podcast tapings, live podcast tapings. One of them is about a podcast called The Catch, which is about global fisheries. That's in partnership with the Walton Foundation. And then there's another one called Counterpoint, which is a new FP podcast that is all the way at the end of the evening. And I believe we have two very feisty debaters. That's Martin Kimani, the former Kenyan ambassador, and Vijay Prashad, who is a very good and creative thinker on the Global South. They're going to be locking horns on how to think about Ukraine and global cooperation. So it'll be a very exciting discussion. Do stick around for that. And lastly, before I let you go, subscribe to FP. If you liked what you've seen here, if you engage with our work online, please do think about subscribing. Very easy to do so. You've got magazines all around you. So I will leave you with that, and I hope to see you back here very soon. I'm Ravi Agrawal. Thanks for being a great audience.